Thank you, Matthew. Should I start?
Well, why don't I read a little introduction first?
Oh, yes,
Yep.
excellent.
So I'd like to introduce my colleague, it's Erica Blacksher. She is the John B. Francis Chair at the Center for Practical Bioethics and a research professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Medicine at the University of Kansas Medical Center. She specializes in population health ethics with a current focus on questions of responsibility and justice raised by U.S. health inequalities and the role of democratic deliberation in advancing health equity and social justice. She has a background in the social determinants of health literature and did some postdoctoral work with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So I'd like to hand it off to Erica and we can go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Matthew, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. I'll get started. We have a lot packed in here. So let me begin. The title of the talk is Health Justice at the Intersection of Class and Race, Whiteness and Mortality Trends in White People with a High School Degree or Less. There are 5 parts to this talk, which sounds like a lot, but as Matthew mentioned, I've built in some intentional moments where I'll stop and take questions if there are some. And also I'm going to move quickly through some of these sections. In the first section, I'll review 2 distinct but related white mortality trends and what I'm calling the main causal story for them. Then I'll turn to questions of justice that are raised, or at least that were raised for me by these white mortality trends, and visit a revised and more complex causal story. Then I'll pivot and speak to the concept of whiteness, and I'll talk about whiteness as a social system, and then move to the question of whether there's a potential role for whiteness in these mortality trends. And then I'll conclude by asking some questions that have lingered for me and for those who have commented on my scholarly work in this area. I do want to begin with a caveat and a warning. It sounds ominous, but I just want to say that I will be using the language of Black and white people as is customary in population health studies. I know that people have preferences, sometimes strong preferences for this sort of nomenclature. I do want to say explicitly that I will not be using the word Caucasian to refer to white people. That word can be traced to racist science that helped to create the categories of white and non-white, and the false and abhorrent idea that the former is superior and the latter is inferior. The warning, I hesitate to call it a trigger warning because I think even a trigger warning and that even that idea has become controversial. What I mean to say is that I have given this talk to many audiences by this point in time, and they've been quite diverse audiences. And what I've learned is that for some, the ideas and issues that I engage can be disturbing or make people uncomfortable, regardless of race, regardless of class. And that is not my intention. I am not an intentional provocateur. I do, however, think we need to start talking about things that are hard to talk about, and that is my intention, and to take seriously what I consider an ethical imperative that has been really beautifully articulated by Nell Irvin Painter, a historian at Princeton University, the author of The History of White People and many other books. She tells us that eliminating the binary definition of whiteness, the toggle between nothingness and awfulness, is essential for a new racial vision that ethical people can share across the color line. I think she's right about that. And one of the implications, among others, is that we need to begin thinking about and understanding whiteness. And that is in part what this work does, looking at these worsening white mortality trends. So in this first part of the talk, I'm going to review 2 distinct but related white mortality trends, an absolute decline in life expectancy and what's called a mortality reversal. Let me just also flag that in this talk, I am not speaking to the elephant in the room, which is the impact that COVID-19 has had on US life expectancy. We do know thus far that it's decreased our life expectancy overall by about a year. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. But this work is really looking at a related but second public health crisis, which is high and rising mortality rates in the US. Um, Let me put my comments here, though, in a bit of context first, which is to say that US life expectancy in the 20th century was a largely uninterrupted success story. That is to say, we saw a rise in life expectancy from 47 to 78 years between 1900 and 2006, with a few notable exceptions, disease specific in nature, the 1918 influenza epidemic, and a setback in 1993 related to HIV/AIDS. We've also seen shifting mortality gaps. We've seen dramatically greater gains in life expectancy among college graduates than those with a high school degree or less. But all groups, including minorities, we've seen good gains, an increase. We've also seen racial and gender gaps narrowing. So racial groups have been people of color, African Americans, Latinos have been making gains. Um, and so we've begun to see that gap closing, but we've seen education gaps widening dramatically. Overall, we see that US life expectancy has lost pace with other countries, and that began around 1980. We see that it stops increasing in 2010. So you see it stalling, in 2010, you see it begin actually declining, decreasing in 2014. And all of this is detailed in very comprehensively in a just released 2021 National Academies of Science report called High and Rising Mortality Rates in Working Age Adults. So this first trend, the life expectancy trend, back in 2012, 2013, researchers began to documented an absolute decline in white women and men who lack high school degrees. Uh, and let me just say, before I go into the details, that life expectancy measures the length of life and is a very sensitive measure of population health because it's reflective of broad societal conditions, people's access to various sorts of important resources and opportunities. And so researchers documented this absolute decline between 3 and 5 years for women and between 6 months and 3 years for men. And these are white men and white women. Now, what this absolute decline in life expectancy did was it then brought the life expectancy for white and Black men and women who lack high school diplomas were now roughly equal. And what researchers found was that this phenomenon was unique to the United States. This was not happening in other places. And this particular researcher looked at several studies looking at this phenomenon, this trend. And what he found was that white women had lost 3 years of life expectancy, and that white men had lost um, about 6 months of life expectancy. Now, the reason why this is important is that rarely do we see this happen in the modern era. Um, for example, when the Soviet Union collapsed, white Russian men lost between 5 and 7 years, and it set everyone's hair on fire. They wanted to explain it. They had never seen it before, at least not in modern history. So when people were talking about a 3-year decline in life expectancy in white women without a high school degree, that got a lot of people's attention in the world of population health and public health, and of course in health policy. And that graph there just shows the now roughly equal life expectancies of white men and women and Black men and women who lack high school diplomas. And those life expectancies are far shorter than their racial counterparts with college degrees. The second trend that's related but distinct are these rising midlife mortality. Mortality measures dying and is also an important measure of health, particularly when we see it happening in midlife. You might have heard sometimes this phenomenon is referred to as deaths of despair. It refers to deaths that are caused by drug overdoses, suicides, alcohol and liver diseases and cirrhosis, and as well as heart disease that is happening here in white people with a high school degree or less. So when you have enough people dying in midlife, um, then you see that that can contribute to this decline in life expectancy. So these trends are related, but also distinct. And and these so-called deaths of despair, they tripled between 1990 and 2017, from 30 per 100,000 to 92 per 100,000. And by 2005, we begin to see deaths of despair in much younger white people. And by 2013, 2014, we see these sorts of deaths ensnaring communities of color. We see it happening in African Americans as well. And this is confirmed and documented in greater detail in that 2021 National Academies of Science report I just noted. So these are some graphs that sort of capture these white deaths of despair, which have been described in detail by Ann Case and Angus Deaton in their book, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism. They too are they are researchers at Yale. And what you see in that top graph are deaths between people. I'm sorry, my something is in the way of me being able to describe this to you. Let me just move that. So you see here, I hope you can see me pointing, men and women with less than a high school, with a high school degree or less, they're dying. Their mortality is much higher than those with college educations. And down here, this speaks to the point I made earlier about this being a phenomenon that is unique to the United States. Now, um, as far as a causal story goes, when these stories first hit, again, the absolute decline getting a lot of press, 2012, 2013, 2014, and then in 2015, 2016, around these deaths of despair, the primary causal story that was told was that it was a decades long processes at work, a disintegration of people's social and economic lives, and that this story passes through pain. So the various causal pathways that various researchers, including Case and Deaton, have spoken to, refer to unraveling socioeconomic status over many decades, which is attributable to what we've seen in this nation: globalization, automation, wage stagnation, and wage loss, a transition from manufacturing to service jobs, the latter of which pay far less and often are not accompanied by things like pensions, healthcare insurance, not to mention the social structures that once created connection and cohesion in communities, such as unions and holiday parties. With this came dimming marriage prospects, family disintegrations, increases in single motherhood, and risky behaviors. And all this is playing out against rising income inequality and a sort of a neoliberal dismantling of the social safety net. And then we can also look at the psychosocial um, pathways here that have been called strain and pain, all of this then causing distress, hopelessness, and various forms of illness, mental and physical. There's also this question that is now being just beginning to be explored by some researchers about the role of early life adversity, suggesting that the people who have been dying in midlife, caught up in these sorts of stories, come from very disadvantaged, very poor, very chaotic families. And we know, of course, that early life exposure to chronic stress becomes embodied and causes early onset of various forms of chronic disease, accelerated aging, what some people call population weathering, which has been well documented in African American populations who have long lived under conditions of socioeconomic stress and volatility, and which is, there's also evidence that population weathering happens in poor white populations, poor white people as well. So let me just stop there with the kind of that first go at these two trends, the absolute decline in life expectancy and rising midlife mortality, and what's really been kind of the primary causal story told. In the next chunk of this, I'm going to revisit that causal story, but let me stop and see if there are questions that are better addressed at this moment than at the end.
Yeah, so we don't have any questions in just yet. So I'll remind everyone who has tuned in that you can use the Q&A tool and the chat tool to submit any questions that you may have. While we wait for people to frantically type in their questions, we can. I actually have one. So you mentioned the sort of like a similar collapse in life expectancy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and some of the research that was done there was the role of deaths of despair. Kind of was it like I guess was there research done around the role of deaths of despair that and what they played in that situation as well?
So I think maybe your question is what did they find in
Yeah, in examining
In
that
these
decline in
Russian
life
men?
expectancy, what did they
Right, I don't
find?
know that they called them deaths of despair. I don't think they did.
Okay.
That nomenclature has sort of been unique to this U.S. phenomenon. Um, I will say that my look at the studies suggests that they ultimately decided that these Russian men had lost 5 years, and in trying to explain it, it was this is going to be woefully inadequate, but the complete loss of a life structure of
Sure.
life ways.
Yeah, I
It
mean,
just disappeared, and Russian men were drinking themselves to death,
yeah.
which alcohol use and abuse is an issue in Russia as it is
Hmm.
in Eastern Bloc countries, and that was a primary driver as
Yeah,
well.
it seems like the sort of like when we get at this kind of unraveling of like social and economic frameworks of lives that would be a similar sort of dynamic there. It is interesting that in the United States it follows shortly after, right? Then like presumable end of the Cold War. But
Yeah, and I'll get to this later, but maybe we should move ahead because there are a couple things I want to say about the fact that the African American community was hit by these phenomena long before
sure,
and
yeah,
suffered the consequences, and there's been a dramatically different response on
yeah,
the part of the American people. So
yeah,
perhaps we
interesting.
can move on.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So, whoops, I did not mean to do that. So, part two, an ethicist does a double take. Um, and let me just say, when I first saw these stories and began to dig into the data as a person who is a population health ethicist and teaches courses or used to teach courses called like When Life Makes You Sick and Social Justice and Health, I incorporated these data, these studies into my teaching and the various talks I was giving as simply as illustrations of examples, if you will, of ways in which health disparities happen, right? So in the modern era, health disparities typically happen in the way that I've described, which is that, better off groups make greater gains, but everyone's sort of moving up the health and longevity escalator. But people who are better off by way of their income, their education, the color of their skin, whiteness, they're making greater gains. But what we actually saw here was a group falling down the health and longevity escalator. And so I took them as an example of one of the ways in which health disparities, as we call them in the United States, um, can happen. So, and this gets a lot of attention for reasons which I've already described, which is that it is not very often that this happens. And everywhere I looked, there were headlines about, what's killing white women. The working class white Americans are now dying in middle age at faster rates than minority groups. This is the first rise in US death rates in years, which surprises experts, and on and on and on. Um, but then, as I began to talk with colleagues and I dug deeper into the media, of course, there was another response, which is hey, if white America is in crisis, what have Black Americans been living through? And as I just noted, there was so the phenomena that we saw white working class communities, lower education whites experience, the disappearing of their jobs, the disappearing of their pensions, the disappearing of their family structures, those social and economic and forces, along with what happens in communities and families, hit uh, Black Americans back in the 80s. And what we saw was the crack cocaine epidemic. And there was no wave of compassion when addicts were hooked, when Black addicts were hooked on crack, as that headline suggests. And as I began to talk with colleagues about these phenomena and this topic more generally, many of my colleagues being people, scholars of color, Latinx and Black and Indigenous, that was a very interesting conversation to have and led me to want to, as an ethicist, begin to explore these issues more systematically than I had to date. And so I wrote a piece called Shrinking Poor White Lifespans, Class, Race, and Health Justice. And the question I asked, and here I was maybe being intentionally provocative, I asked, do these white mortality trends constitute an injustice? Or is justice being done? Should we care, or is it racist to care? Because what I was hearing out there in the media ecosystem and among my own scholarly circles was that whether one viewed this as an injustice or not was not, there was no obvious answer to that question. And this article very intentionally undertook a systematic analysis of the question. And just to foreshadow, I won't go through the details of that argument. It's a complicated argument, but to answer the question, how should we ethically evaluate the absolute decline in life expectancy in low education white people? What I concluded is that the nature and magnitude of harms represented by the longevity losses in low education white people violate key normative criteria used to make determinations of justice. Yes, these mortality trends are unjust. And I go on to say that, to explain just quickly, white mortality trends reflect, I argued, a societal failure to mitigate the effects of family poverty and pathology, possibly intergenerational in character, on the development of children's talents and abilities, including capacities for self-respect and self-determination. Evidence documenting these mortality trends supplies strong evidence that low education whites lack genuine opportunities to be and do things they have reasons to value, including being healthy and staying alive. Now, remember, I didn't say this, but in this paper, I was looking quite specifically at that absolute decline in life expectancy in white people who had not had the opportunity to get a high school degree. But what I also said in this piece was that this judgment does not do away with concerns about the potential role of whiteness and racisms in white mortality trends. And the question I raise in this piece is, what if whiteness is implicated in these mortality trends? What if white privilege, which is enabled and enacted via structural, institutional, interpersonal forms of racism, no longer secures, to the extent it once did, jobs, wages, and other material goods that protected the health of low education white people? What if white privilege, enabled and enacted via structural, institutional, interpersonal racisms, no longer secures, to the extent it once did, a psychological position of superiority that protected a sense of self-esteem and self-respect in low education white people? In other words, are racisms, whether they're structural or cultural or institutional or interpersonal in nature, at work in these mortality trends? And if so, how should that inform our ethical assessment? I mean, if the diminishment of white privilege is a part of the causal story of worsening white mortality trends, then isn't that a good thing? Which is to say, we don't want white privilege to have a place in this world. We don't want white supremacy. So how do we reconcile the good, the dismantling of white supremacy, with the bad of white deaths of despair? If racisms are a part of the causal story, should the harm worsening white mortality trends, should they count as an injustice? So those are the hard questions I was asking in that article. Now, that article came out in 2018, and in 2019, some researchers at the University of Toronto, a kind of a premier program in population health, they put together a story for these white deaths of despair that wasn't just a class causal story, the main story I already described, but a race class causal story. They say that the experience of an absolute decline in economic conditions, both short-term and long-term, may be producing what they call a racial threat response among whites. So let me quickly explain what their argument is. They're pointing out that a plausible causal story of these white deaths of despair must explain why mortality trends are happening in white people, but not in racial minorities who have long endured the same or worse economic conditions. So they argue that perceived status threat is driving white mortality trends, that there's a misperception among white people, these white people with a high school degree or less, that their social status as a racial group is threatened by socioeconomic gains among people of color, that worsening economic conditions and anxiety about those conditions is integral to status anxiety, that they interact to generate psychological, and physiological stressors that can explain white mortality trends. I just want to note something I did in the article and something I always do in this talk, and as well as something they do in their own study, that this explanation aligns with the explanation for former President Trump's victory, which, at first it was about status anxiety and economic anxiety, as experts, policy wonks were trying to explain his rise to the Oval Office. But what it came down to, what experts finally uh, uh, put together, was that it was something they called racial economics, the belief that undeserving groups, here I'm quoting, are getting ahead while your group is left behind socioeconomically. There's the specific source for that. Um, what we see is that rising or stagnating mortality rates in higher status whites, this is something Siddiqui et al. At the University of Toronto point out, supply further support for this status threat hypothesis. So let me just stop there real quickly. So to see if there are questions about this, right? So I'm doing this sort of the work of an ethicist, trying to navigate ethical questions raised by these worsening white mortality trends. I'm suggesting that white privilege, white supremacy might be implicated in them. And then we see a study come out a year later, an empiric study, suggesting that that's precisely what happened. Whether they're accurate or not is unclear. I'm not sure, Ann Case and Angus Deaton I don't know what they would make of this hypothesis. I haven't seen anything by them on this. Are there questions from the participants?
Not at the moment. I have one clarifying question. So you said that in the Siddiqui et al. Paper that it was a perception of status, like of the perception of status threat, or I guess like status, the perception of status threat was driving mortality trends. Is the sort of perceived status threat. So what is the difference here between sort of a perceived status threat and like actual sort of like I guess experienced degradation and like material
Right. I mean,
conditions?
so Matthew, that's precisely the question, and I'll get to it a bit later. So, you know, when you perceive that some harms have to act on the mind in the world of
Sure.
population health and social determinants, some health harms act immediately on the body. You're exposed to pollution, you take in that pollution, you swallow poison, you get sick, right? But many harms have to act on the mind before they become biologically plausible, before they kind of get baked into our biology. And what they're pointing out here is that when we're talking about status, it's a perception. And in this case, I think quite rightly, they're saying it's a misperception on the part of white people. So it's taking that experience of socioeconomic disintegration and placing it inside an explanation that's comparative, right?
So it's a way that they're accounting for a reality that they're experiencing, but it's a misaccount or a fail, like a sort of a bad account.
Well, Siddiqui et al. Are arguing that status threat can explain a lot of this. What Case and Deaton were doing was saying that it's the actual experience of socioeconomic disintegration. And what Siddiqui et al. They're not dismissing the hypothesis that socioeconomic disintegration is bad for bodies and can kill them early. There's voluminous evidence of that. But they're saying that alone can't explain everything, because racial minorities have long been steeped in socioeconomic hardship, and they're not killing themselves. They're not dying in midlife.
Sure.
Okay, so Siddiqui and El saw a gap in the explanation. And so they're saying it's actually a both and kind of thing, that there has to be an added layer, if you will.
So that puts us at 1232.
Great. So let me keep going, if I may,
Okay.
unless some urgent question has entered the chat.
Nope, not yet.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about what whiteness is, or the way scholars think about what whiteness is. And let me begin by saying, I love this quote by my colleague, Matt Ray at Temple University. He says, as a nation, we still do not know how to think straight about whiteness, nor about what it means to be white. He actually said that made that particular comment in a commentary on the A-Job article that I published in 2018. So, people are still sorting out what whiteness is, but let me say that whiteness has long been subject to expert observation and investigation by African Americans and luminaries. James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, W.E.B. Du Bois. But it emerges as an academic field of inquiry in the 1990s. And there you see a lot of white scholars investigating, excavating, if you will, whiteness, along with, of course, scholars of color as well. But you begin to see white scholars get into the game of trying to understand what whiteness is. And this whole enterprise is complicated by a general lack of awareness among some, perhaps many, white people that they are actually members of a racial group and that they benefit from racial privilege. So concepts of whiteness, you can talk about it as a racial system, you can talk about it as a social system. I prefer talking about it as a social system, which includes race and racial ideas, because it's a broader construct, and I think does more work for us in terms of understanding what it is. But let me just unpack these two quickly. So when you're thinking about whiteness as a racial system, we're talking about material, psychological, political, and cultural awards of having white or light colored skin. It becomes a marker of racial identity associated with privileges that create social differentiation and domination. And here I have a quote from Cheryl Harris from a very well known, much cited article. She says, in ways so embedded that it is rarely apparent, the set of assumptions, privileges, and benefits that accompany the status of being white have become a valuable asset. When we broaden the lens and think about whiteness as a social system, it gets more multifaceted in that whiteness now integrates other differences among us that we know matter, at the very least for our health, for our social status, for our life chances, right? So it integrates class, gender, religion, geographic identities, axes of social differentiation and domination that interact with whiteness as a racial category. Whiteness now becomes a more complicated cultural identity associated with privileges that create social differentiation and social inequality. This intersectional perspective, as I've alluded to, complexifies whiteness because not all white people benefit to the same degree from their whiteness because they're differently situated. Differently situated in terms of their class origin, their class, their gender, their sexual orientation, their geography, their ability, disability, and so on. So whiteness as a multidimensional concept, I've chosen these two quotes, notice from very different moments in time. A 1997 from Winant in an essay that I highly recommend if you want to sort of see a seminal piece on whiteness. He says, whiteness is embedded in a highly articulated social structure and system of significations having to do with socioeconomic status, religious affiliation, ideologies of individualism, opportunity, citizenship, nationalism, etc. And then much more recent, Jonathan Metzl, in his 2019 book, Dying of Whiteness, says, whiteness becomes a formation worth living and dying for. And in myriad ways and on multiple levels, white Americans bet their lives on particular sets of meanings associated with whiteness, even in the face of clear threats to mortality or to common sense. So the work that whiteness does is that it's this first, socially constructed, not a biological reality. It sets boundaries and expectations for privileges, freedoms, and resources. It functions, and here's why it's hard for white people to see sometimes, it functions as the norm, the natural, the universal. It operates, in other words, unmarked, undefined, unexamined, as the unstated standard against which racialized others are defined and judged. Whiteness then, in I think this is really important to the causal story here. It's something I've been exploring in my own scholarship. Whiteness enables individualism, individualistic conceptions of identity, individualistic explanations of success and failure. There's a lack of awareness or active denial of membership in racial groups or salience of race that suppresses and denies the existence of a racial system. There's a lack of awareness or active denial of membership in a social class. Remember, America is a classless society. It's just something we don't talk about class in America, as historian Nancy Eisenberg says. And so the salience of class structure may be lost on white people, and it works to suppress or it works to deny the existence of a class system. So, how might these ideas about whiteness and the way they work um, be causally implicated in white mortality trends? And let me just note something that's obvious but may be difficult to see, which is keep in mind that it's a decline in resources and social position that we're documenting here, right, with the help of demographers and social epidemiologists. And that reflects a past position of relative privilege that has been enabled by racist politics, policies, and practices that delivered to white people disproportionately more social, material, and political resources. And these resources are well established as fundamental causes of health inequalities. Um, so let's look at possible, I'm going to look at possible psychosocial, pardon me for skipping around here. Let's look at possible psychosocial pathways. So um, if there are expectations for socioeconomic resources, and then those expectations are not met, then the people experiencing the unmet expectations may mean that people have a reduced capacity, a lessened capacity, no experience with coping with and responding to adversity and hardship or to the status loss, right? And that could lead to anger, frustration, domestic violence within the household, substance abuse, all of which are bad for health. And what there's some literature to suggest is that white people are far less likely to invoke redemption narratives to make sense of adversity, to make sense of hardship, to make sense of unmet expectations than are people of color who have long had to find ways to cope with these same circumstances. And that has health implications, by the way. The meaning we make or don't make out of these hardships impacts our health and our longevity. Another possibility here is that the interpretation of adversity may be individualistic, as already noted, may sort of fall within this meritocratic ideology, or may be racist, producing either externalized blame of racialized individual others for, here I'm putting in quotes, disrupting expectations, blaming Black and Brown others for taking away my jobs, for example, or my pay or my wages, or may result in internalized self blame. I have failed. I have not been able to make it, right? And both of these are documented, both sorts of forms of internalization or individualization, whether it be externalizing or internalizing, both of these harm health. There's also a documented reluctance to use social programs, for example, SNAP, or a resistance to Medicaid in order to avoid stigma and shame, which may reflect beliefs in personal responsibility or may reflect actively, overtly or covertly racist beliefs. And then I'll just point out, because the impact on white women without high school degrees was so significant, that these diminished marriage prospects and decoupling of marriage from childbearing has brought a double day or triple day for women as both full-time breadwinners and caretakers of children and family members. And here are a few possible practice policy pathways, the ways in which whiteness may be implicated here. So how is it that white people got access to these opioid prescriptions when we know that, so they had far better access, forgive me, they had far better access, not only related to just healthcare access, but also we know that there are documented racial disparities in opioid prescription and pain management practices. So you take two patients, they go in, they complain of pain. The white patient is far more likely to get access to pain management and opioids. And so in this roundabout upside down world, it is white privilege that's actually giving white people access to these opioids and then leading to their addiction and leading to early death and overdoses. You see something similar with high levels of support in some white communities for gun rights, which signals male privilege and patriarchy. You could go to our American early history for that. Uh, Only certain people got guns, and they were typically white men. You also see, just in looking at who's killing themselves with guns, it is typically white men. It is more often the case that white women are taking pills and other forms of poison. Um, there's also, and I've sort of alluded to this already, there are high levels of opposition to social protections and programs and opposition to regulations and policies that would protect all people and their health, uh, including white people. And that opposition is anchored either in individualistic meritocratic narratives or racism or both. And both of these reflect whiteness. Here's a quote from an important article published in 2018. It came out just before my piece was published, looking at whiteness as a framework for understanding both the ways in which whiteness can benefit white people, the health of white people, and harm the health of white people. They say the limited economic safety net and few guaranteed benefits for workers puts a ceiling on the potential physical health that the population can achieve, which disproportionately harms people of color, but can also harm whites who are numerically larger. Okay, and then I won't go into this in any depth, but there are researchers looking at early life adversity as a potential uh, driver of this absolute decline in life expectancy in white people without a high school degree and this rise in midlife mortality in people with a high school degree or less. So um, the the question uh, the question I have, the question that has been raised, um, all of this raises is, so these are the ways in which whiteness, let me just go back. These are some of the ways in which whiteness and racism may be implicated in these white mortality trends. But to your question, Matthew, you said, well, you know, how does the actual experience of socioeconomic, psychosocial, familial disintegration, um, how does that square with the perception of lost status, right? And so there's a question: is racism, are racisms, just to acknowledge the various manifold nefarious forms that exist, are they necessarily implicated in these deaths? And I'm drawn to a quote by Sarah Smarsh in her book Heartland, which maybe some of you have read. She says that she grew up poor and white in Kansas, in rural Kansas. She said, most struggling whites I know live lives of quiet desperation, mad at their white bosses, not resentment of their. My father seeks is not a return to times that were worse for women and people of color, but progress toward a society in which everyone can get by, including his white college educated son. This would be Sarah's brother, by the way, who graduated into the Great Recession and for 10 years sold his own plasma for gas money. After being laid off during that recession in 2008, my dad had to cash in his retirement to make ends meet while looking for another job. He has labored nearly every day of his life and has no savings beyond social security. So the question is how is whiteness implicated in that story, in Sarah's story? Or in the piece that I raised, where I'm the one raising the question of these of whiteness and white supremacy being implicated, because I toggle back and forth between different ways to think about this. I too ask, well, there may be alternative explanations for the despair. Chronic material deprivation that precludes, say, being able to pursue an education, reliably pay rent, put food on the table, and access medical and dental services can turn life into an unrelenting grind. The distress, fear, illness, disability, alienation, loneliness, and isolation that often accompany lives burdened by chronic poverty can foreclose any hope for a better future. A story of origin so riddled with adversity and chaos that graduating high school was not possible might do it too. One can imagine despair taking hold under these conditions without a lick of racism playing a role. because low education whites are objectively bad off. The next sentence after that sentence is, but people of color are worse off. So it's complicated, right? And so that leaves some lingering ethical and sociological questions. And I'm just going to point some of these out, and then I'll stop and we can talk together. So,
Well, and you asked me to give you a 15-minute warning, and that's now.
oh, great. This
Yep.
is perfect timing then. So one question is, are there forms, I'm sorry if you're seeing that thing just pop up. Are there forms of whiteness that are not racist? I don't know the answer to that question. I wonder, the question seems important though, because we've been told by scholars like Nell Irvin Painter and Jonathan Metzl and others that we need to talk about what whiteness is. So are there forms of whiteness that are not racist? Whoops, going the wrong way. And here's a question that was put to me by a terrific scholar, very important scholar, Yolanda Wilson at Howard University. And she raises questions of responsibility, which I explore in depth in this article. She says the question becomes for me whether the fact that low education whites reject the notion of a social responsibility to create equal opportunity for health for all releases us from collective responsibility to take specific steps to bring about such a state of affairs for low education whites. So what she's saying there is, if in fact lower education whites political preferences and policy preferences are such that they aren't typically in favor of social policies and public programs that create the conditions in which all can be healthy. And we now see their own life and longevity prospects tanking. Do we have a responsibility to step in and do something specifically that addresses their pain and suffering? It's an important question. And then this, which I just left from two colleagues and friends, Hetty Lee at Washington University and Margaret Hicken at University of Wisconsin. They wrote a terrific piece where they said that they agreed that these white mortality trends constituted an injustice. But, and here I quote them, even if we can agree that the lifespan contraction is unjust, we cannot assume that the interventions will be. Vitally important point, which is, how do we move forward in a way to create the conditions in which all people can be healthy and not replicate and reproduce the racial inequities that have long been entrenched? And with this, I'm going to stop talking. I apologize if I've spoken too quickly or, and have gotten things at points muddled. I'm happy to take any form of question, comment, observation, pushback.
All right, well, we've got a couple questions, and before I get into them, I'll just remind people that you can submit questions via the chat or the Q&A tools, and I'll see them here and read them out, and we'll see what we can do to respond to them. So first, I'd like to give you this one from Jason Glenn. It says, I can't help but read this work in conversation with Louis Laquan's Punishing the Poor, Jonathan Metzl's Dying of Whiteness, and Heather McGee's The Sum of Us. These analyses would indicate that reason for this lower life expectancy would not be declining white privilege, but the harvest of role that white supremacy plays in the decline of social solidarity and the enduring politics of the undeserving poor. That Americans have increasingly insisted on defunding public goods and services like education and healthcare, and shifting those resources to policing and incarceration because they fear that undeserving poor, i.e. Blacks and immigrants, will benefit from them. How do you see your analysis read against this idea? So I think this actually came in just before you read the Metzl quote.
Well, hi, Jason. Thank you for that excellent question. And I look forward to actually being able to have conversations with you about that question. My response is not going to be adequate. I haven't read the Sum of Us book yet. It's sitting, staring at me right now on my desk to read. And Metzl's book, of course, helps us understand some things. What I do want to say is that I have, if I'm understanding the question correctly, and it's a multi-part question, so forgive me if I've gotten it wrong. let me pick out of it your comments about an utter failure of social responsibility, of social solidarity in this nation, because that is where that's where my scholarly attention has begun to turn, and wondering how we can. I don't want to use the word rebuild because I'm not sure we've been a nation that's identified with the idea of solidarity. We're an individualistic nation, and some of our core values like self-reliance and personal responsibility have been with us for a very long time. With that said, there have been moments in history when we have had a greater sense of the commons, where we have pulled together to do things that needed to be done. And at this point, I think our greatest challenge is that we can't even agree on the facts that define what our challenges are. So um, I I guess what I want to say is for me, the burning question is how can we create some sense of shared knowledge, some mutual understanding, and and if not common purpose, at least joint purpose. I'm going to stop there because I'm now realizing that I probably didn't respond to your question well at all. And so be happy. Please feel free to put it in the chat again, with a focus on what specifically you want me to respond to, and I'll tackle it. Matthew, are there other questions in the chat?
Well, we've got one from Terry here that kind of is in the vein that you were just talking about, which is you refer to or belief in personal responsibility in correlation with white racism. Is there any role for personal responsibility as explanatory for the increased mortality and worsening health among low education white populations?
Right. Well, if I understand the question, Terry, what I have looked at in that what I looked at in that article, and what I've continued to reflect on, that I think Professor Wilson's commentary is speaks to quite importantly, is that I think there is personal responsibility, but we need to be consistent, right? So those of us in sort of the health equity world, the social determinants of health world, we're really kind of weary of the personal responsibility arguments that get made around health, because we understand that social context, our environments can be overwhelming in terms of shaping uh, behaviors and choices related to health. And so we want to look upstream at the social drivers, right? Well, upstream of the social drivers, which we define in terms of the social and the material and the environmental conditions, are social values. So, what are our social values that are creating the social conditions, the social, material, and environmental conditions that are making some people sick and die early, and keeping others of us healthy? And so responsibility is hugely important. And this is where I think we have to look at the um, sort of, I would say, policy and political preferences of the people white people who are dying early, and getting sick and dying early. You know, we have to examine that and ask, why aren't they trying to create why don't they see that they need different preferences in order to create a world, in order to create a nation, in order to create a community where all can be healthy, including themselves, including people of color, including immigrants, and so on and so forth. So there is a role for it. And I guess what I did, let me just say what I did in the piece, which was because um, I traced the absolute decline in life expectancy to very early life conditions. I argued that the processes were set in motion far before we began to hold people responsible for the choices that they make, um, and took seriously the way in which context shape people's, even as they age and then they become adults, shape their ideas about the world. To the extent that racism is baked into that, then of course we need to hold people accountable for racism and reject those preferences, reject those ideologies. Um, so I don't know if I've answered your question other than to say that responsibility is hugely important in this analysis, um, and actually, raises some empiric questions about the degree to which um, we could look at, for example, we could look at election data. I was fascinated to see that the 2016 election, when you looked at, uh, because that election was so dissected, if you looked at the lowest quintile in terms of income and education, and you looked at that with race, that more poor white people than not voted for Hillary Clinton over Donald J. Trump. When you moved up to the next quintile, which might be called working class, you saw that more working class white people voted for Trump than voted for Clinton. And so that was fascinating to me because it's the working class demographic that's experiencing the status, arguably, is experiencing the status loss, whereas people maybe who are white and intergenerationally poor know what that is, aren't experiencing a loss, but rather just experiencing the sort of the long experience of being poor and their people being poor, generation after generation. But I guess what I wanted to say there was, um, you know, it'd be interesting to look at, and there are of course political scientists who do this, who study, you know, where racism is concentrated in terms of subpopulations. If I've misunderstood the question, Terry, feel free to reformulate.
Got one here from submitted anonymously. It says, what are the suggested remedies for addressing both health disparities and contracting expectancy in whites? What does a just intervention look like?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and it was fascinating for me to look at the commentaries. There were 10 commentaries on the AJOB article because I wasn't I in the piece. Oops, I'm sorry about that. I did not. Well, I can't fix that now.
I gotcha.
Hang on a minute. Can you fix that?
Here, I'll just turn off the screen share.
Okay. There were a number of people who understood me to say that we should intervene because I argued that it wasn't that this lifespan contraction was an injustice, justice that society should intervene. I actually didn't make that argument. I was just trying to make a judgment of justice, a determination of justice about this lifespan contraction. Um, and so some of the commentators said we should not intervene. Some commentators said we should intervene, and here's how. For example, Matt Ray said we needed a kind of a ramping up of investments in rural areas across America, which themselves are racially diverse, but tend to have more white people than people of color, but that they should be rural America should be invested in so that everyone could benefit. But then to Hetty and Margaret's point about, what is a just intervention, I think it's truly complicated because very often what we see in the world of health disparities and how they're reproduced is that if you devise a policy or a program, some form of intervention, if you will, better off people tend to benefit first and most from that intervention, right? And so, what scholars argue is that you need to make the intervention um, as universal as possible so that it's not tied to having individual sort of resources or individual information or knowledge, but it's sort of taken up, if you will, like in the water, kind of like fluoride, if you will. It's in the water, and everyone who drinks that water benefits. But even there, we see that with these interventions, they can replicate or even exacerbate health disparities. So I don't have an answer to your question other than to say it's it's an important one, And it's a worrisome one, an ethically worrisome one, because uh, our interventions just tend, no matter how carefully designed to benefit all, to benefit those who are better off. Whether better off because they have a little more education, they have a little more income, they have whiter skin, etc. They speak the language.
And that brings us to
That's a very dire note to end on.
well, I will say, yeah, we're at one. I have one other question here, if you have time for it. If not, we can call it.
No, I'm happy to. Here,
Okay, let's see. Yeah, let's see if we can get this one last one in. It says, is there any benefit of looking at racism through the lens of classism instead of classism through the lens of racism? If whiteness, for the most part, is lost on white people, would it help us focus more on solidarity if we looked at everybody together with a view of haves and have-nots?
Yeah, I love that question, because one of the commentaries, my friend and colleague Marion Danis at the National Institutes of Health Department of Bioethics focused her commentary on the need to focus on solidarity. And I think that's right. But there's a but here, which is to say, I don't think we can pretend that class and race and gender and these differences that are dividing us uh, can just be swept under the rug. I think we actually have to talk about these differences with an eye toward solidarity. So maybe that's what this person who asked the question is his or him herself or herself actually suggesting. I think we do need to begin wondering exploring how we can build social solidarity, but not in a kumbaya sense of, oh, we're all just going to pretend that these racial categories don't exist and don't divide us, and that class doesn't exist and doesn't divide us, and so on and so forth. So I, I think that we have to figure out how to talk constructively about these differences with an eye toward um, building bridges and finding common ground and talking with not just mutual respect but mutual concern.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Erica Blacksher. This has been a great presentation, and thank you for everyone who was able to join us today. As a closing note, I'll just remind people that these sessions are recorded. You can review them on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Practical Bioethics, and you'll find the playlist there. We've got another one coming together for next month, so we hope to see you then. And just hope everyone has a good rest of the week and a good spring. So,
thank you for the invitation to be with you all today. Thanks very much, guys.
we'll see you next time.
Yep.